This video has been a long time coming, but finally it has arrived. Why is it taking so long, you ask? Well, it's kind of obvious. Actually, just kidding. If this is your first time being here, you probably have no clue, but I've moved. That's right. Look at this huge space. If you've watched some of my last videos, you'll know that most of them were filmed in my tiny little office. So I'm pretty stoked about this, and I'm turning my new unfinished basement, at least this side of it, not that side over there, into an office / YouTube studio. It's going to be a work in progress. I don't have the funds to make it, how I want immediately, but eventually I'm going to make a video showing the process of building my studio. All right, enough of that. Back to what you guys came here for. Today, I'm going to be comparing the Sony A7s III versus the Panasonic S1H. I'm not going to compare everything. I'm just going to compare the features that seem to be the most important to you guys, like, for example, image quality, color science, Vlog versus S-Log3, low light, you guys get it. If you guys enjoy this video and want me to compare the menus, ergonomics, or any other features on these cameras, let me know down in the comments. Enough talking though, let's get into this video. My name's Dustin, your video tour guide, and please keep your arms and legs inside your chairs at all times. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the video. Real quick before we get started, if you would like to get more involved with the community and just looking for some like-minded individuals, I have a Discord channel. You're more than welcome to join and hang out. There's a link down in the description. Cool, so let's get right into this video. Like I mentioned in the beginning, for this video, I'm going to be comparing the things you guys thought were most important to compare for this video, and those are image quality, color science, dynamic range, specifically in Vlog and S-Log3, low light, rolling shutter, and IBIS. There's plenty more to compare on these cameras, but these are kind of the big ones. I'm definitely planning to make more videos on these cameras in the future, so if you have suggestions, leave a comment below. I also want to give a little disclaimer. These comparisons may not be the most scientific, and I'm not like Gerald Undone and have very in-depth technical videos, but I do try to give you guys accurate and relevant information so you can make a more informed decision if you are considering buying one of these cameras. With that, let's start off by comparing image quality. To compare these for image quality, I shot these shots in the natural profile on both the A7s III and Panasonic S1H. I got a shot in 6K on the S1H, and I shot these shots in 4K at Ultra HD at 24 frames per second in 4:2 10-bit. Honestly, it's almost like splitting hairs. In terms of sharpness and noise, I don't really see a difference, even if I zoom in to 500%, even on the 6K clip compared to the 4K clips. When I put my denoiser on the clips and compared the two, the A7s III had slightly more noise, but again, we're just splitting hairs and it isn't even noticeable when you zoom out or even hardly when you're zoomed in. One thing to mention too, I shot both of these clips at the base ISO for that picture profile, so there shouldn't be any variables affecting noise level there. There are some differences when it comes to color, but we will get into color a bit later. When we jump to image quality in slow motion, specifically at 60 frames per second, I got the same results. Visibly, even at 500%, there is virtually no difference, but when I used my denoiser to see if there was a difference, the A7s III had slightly more noise, but again, we're splitting hairs. It's possible with sharpness as well, you could get some different results using different lenses or even shooting a chart, but I felt like it was more important to show some comparisons as if you were shooting like a subject or a scene, since most of us aren't really making videos using a camera chart. So take my opinion with a grain of salt and form your own. When it comes to color science, I do want to say that my opinion on color science is that it's subjective, and if you like the color of another camera, you can match the colors by using the tools in your color grading software. Obviously though, that does take some work, and some people don't want to do that depending on what you're shooting or what your workflow is, me included. The reason I shot the image quality tests in the natural profile instead of the standard profile was just because that's the profile I usually shoot in when I don't plan on doing a ton of color grading. I knew you'd probably want to see the comparisons though in the standard profile. So that's what I did with the color science test. These shots are all shot in the standard picture profile. Overall, when comparing the two, the Sony A7S III has a little more yellowish greenish hue to it compared to the S1H, where you could say the S1H has more blue hue to it. On the shot outside with overcast lighting, I don't really mind either shot in terms of color, but when I came inside and just used the window for light, I definitely prefer the S1H. It just looks more pleasing to me overall, and it lands more of a natural looking look. Whereas the A7S III, again, had that yellowish greenish hue to it. It also seemed to make my skin look a little more red or pink, which I don't really love. Keep in mind though, when I saw this is subjective, and you could probably make them match pretty easily, especially since these are both 10-bit color. I also shot a low light comparison in the standard profile, and again, I prefer the S1H over the A7S III. The noise just looks better to me, as well as the color of the light coming off my phone when I turn it on. The reason it is yellow instead of white or blue, by the way, is because I had that color shift setting on. Let's move on to the S-Log3 and V-Log comparison when it comes to dynamic range and color. A few things, again, the color is subjective because you could get different results if you use a different method of converting the footage or use a LUT of some kind. To keep these comparisons consistent, I use the IBIS method of converting the footage, which is a more future-proof method of converting your footage, and so hopefully nobody in the comments gets mad that I applied just some random LUT and compared the two. As far as dynamic range, I didn't use any kind of dynamic range checker. All I did was match my exposures, shot from the base ISOs, which are the same for both cameras at 640 when shooting in log, and tried my best to get a few comparisons that would make more sense to shoot in log for both cameras over another profile. I will say I definitely prefer the color on the A7S III and S-Log3 than using the standard profile. But something interesting, I did a mixed lighting test comparing the two, and I 100% prefer the S1H. I don't know what it is with mirrorless cameras, but when you start mixing daylight and tungsten, there's always like this unpleasing mix of the two, in my opinion. See how the A7S III is very blue on the daylight side of the light? That's what I'm talking about. But on the S1H, that unpleasing blue goes away and makes it more pleasing to look at. Just something I noticed, and I definitely prefer that on the S1H. Here's a better comparison of the dynamic range of the two. This is where I prefer the look on the A7S III over the S1H. The S1H does a good job, but there's something about the shadows looking better on the A7S III over the S1H. The A7S III just seems to have more richer, deeper blacks and a more natural looking blacker shadows over the S1H, and the S1H is kind of like raising the shadows and not making it look as deep and black. This does kind of make sense to me though, because the A7S III has more stops of dynamic range over the S1H. For the low light comparison, I have two to look at. The first, I put the cameras at their second native ISOs in their log profiles, the S1H at 4000 and the A7S III at 12,800. Then I had to dial in the aperture in order to match the exposure, and I was super surprised. The S1H handled the noise super well when I look at the comparison to the A7S III. The S1H seemed to hold up better in terms of color as well. Now these also are where things get interesting, because the A7S III is known as the low light king, which, it's true, this thing can basically see in the dark. But how does the image hold up the higher you crank the ISO? So for these next shots, you've actually seen one already in the standard profile. I matched the f-stop at 4 or f5.6, I can't remember, but I also matched the ISO. In theory, the S1H should look worse and more noisy because you're cranking the ISO further from its native ISO of 4000 in Vlog. These next shots were shot at ISO 51200 because that's as high as the S1H can go in Vlog. I didn't see a point in doing a comparison any higher. First, in the standard profile, I was very surprised how well the S1H handled the low light comparing it to the A7S III. It is pretty noisy, but to me it is much more pleasing to look at over the A7S III. The A7S III is much softer and the noise, I don't know, it just isn't as good looking noise. That's the thing to me, noise can look better than other noise on other cameras. Then for the log profiles, it does bring in this kind of strange green hue, but I don't know, when I compare it to the A7S III, everything is just so much softer again and just has much more unpleasing noise to me. Of course, we could add a denoiser and add some sharpening, but just in terms of straight out of camera, I would definitely take the S1H over the A7S III. Let's move on to the IBIS comparisons. For the first test, this is with no IBIS settings on. Here's the IBIS set to normal on the S1H and standard on the A7S III. And finally, the E stabilization on the S1H and the IBIS set to active on the Sony. I will say that the Sony's IBIS has improved from older models, but the S1H does outperform it in my opinion, which does make sense since on paper it has more stops of stabilization. There is one interesting comparison also to make though. The A7S III has a new feature where it records the gyro information, and via Catalyst Browse, which is just a free software from Sony, you can stabilize the footage even further, which it does a very good job at doing, and it deserves a video of testing on its own. You can do some tweaks to make it possibly smoother and better than what you see, but it really does a great job, and if a clip is just a little too shaky, this is a super good route to go to fix that. I'd be interested to see how it compares to like using warp stabilizer. I also tested to see how warpy the corners would get when you're shooting at wider focal lengths, and I would say that I think the A7S III does a better job at managing that warpiness. For this last test, I was testing rolling shutter. This one is pretty easy to determine a winner, and it is the A7S III. The S1H has some pretty crazy rolling shutter. Sony has done a very good job with this camera at managing that distortion. I get there are ways to reduce this by raising the shutter, etc., but I'm just saying it how it is. The A7S III is the clear winner. So what are my final thoughts? The S1H, in my opinion, did win in a lot of areas that I compared. Some were clear, but some there wasn't really a clear difference between the two. Keep in mind that I only compared the features that both cameras have and what you guys thought were most important for me to compare. I'm going to be releasing another video going over the big differences between the two cameras and what features each camera has that the other does not. And I probably missed some things that people are going to comment about, but there were things that just weren't worth comparing. For example, the big one I'm probably going to get comments about is autofocus. Guys, it's not even worth my time to compare. The A7S III's autofocus is incredible, and I can already tell you it will absolutely demolish the S1H, even with the recent firmware update that came to the S1H improving autofocus. Speaking of which, expect a video on that soon. Oh, and to answer the question, which is best? Neither. They both have their differences and have advantages and disadvantages to both. They are just tools that serve different purposes for different needs. Anyways, guys, I hope you found this video helpful. And again, take everything with a grain of salt because a lot of the things I said could just be my opinion, and it is up to you guys to take the information I've provided and determine what your opinion is. If you think I've missed something though, be sure to comment below and let me know, and I will either try to add it into a future video or make a separate video on it. One last thing, if you support what I do and want to support me, be sure to check out the links in the description. That helps make these videos possible, or you can also support the channel by hitting the subscribe button and the bell button to be notified of future uploads. In the meantime though, happy filming. Now put your hands up like you're some kind of influencer and look at the sun.